Well, as you know, David has the new book out, Truth in Our Times, and he is the Deputy General Counsel at the New York Times. So I'm going to let him actually explain that in a minute. He can introduce that part. But David has been at the Times for 17 years. And in case all of you think you came to listen to a lawyer drone on about various case law and statutes, David started as a journalist. So in Iowa.
That's right.
The Quad City Times.
That's it.
I think it was. And taught journalism and was its advisor for student media. But got a little more sense than some of us and went to law school at age 34. And he is what I would call a journalist lawyer. I've worked with a few lawyers through the years and at the Times also. And David is one of those people, a lot of lawyers do just start quoting, the law to you when you ask about some issue, a story going in the paper. David would always look at us and say, even though it was a huge challenge, some libel potential, well, let's see if we can figure out a way to let you do this. He never tried to keep anything out of the paper. And that's very rare, I can assure you of that. So, Mr. Deputy General Counsel, why don't you explain to people what that is?
Right, yeah.
And then we'll bounce back and forth, I think.
I think it's Kurt Vonnegut who said if you can't explain to a third grader what you do for a living, you're a fraud. So I'm going to try to meet that test tonight. But thank you, Charles, and thank you, Greg. As Deputy General Counsel, my principal role is to advise the newsroom on the whole range of legal problems that would come out of any sort of big journalism organization. So I'm doing pre-publication review for libel. I am advising our reporters on news gathering and the legality of news gathering. It used to be we worried a lot about trespassing. We now worry about going on Facebook and scraping data and that sort of thing. I help when we get subpoenas for notes or sources. And a big part of what we have done over the last 5 years at the Times is become a leader in litigating freedom of information suits. We felt that too many bureaucrats were getting away with too much secrecy, and the only option we had, no matter how frustrating or hard these cases were, was to sue. We've done more than 65 suits against the government, against the federal government since 2008. And that occupies a big part of what we do, just trying to push back against secrecy. Greg pointed out that I was always the kind of guy always kind of lawyer who said, can I help you get this in the paper? That's what I see as my role, and that has been a Times tradition. But I remember that the first week I was at the Times, first couple weeks at the Times, I was invited down to meet with our business staff, and the business editor, Glenn Cramont at the time, makes this big pitch about how I'm here and that when he was at another newspaper, legal was where stories went to die, but that wasn't how it was at the New York Times, that the lawyers were helping him get stuff in the paper. And I remember thinking at the time, what am I supposed to say now? Oh, no, that's not me. I'm a different, I didn't know if he was co-opting me or not, but it worked. It was the kind of thing where you're going to join forces with him on that. Though, one thing I would say is somebody once introduced me the way you just done, Greg, and said, he believes in journalism. He helps us get everything in the paper. And I said, good thing I was not a banking lawyer a decade ago, because I would have been telling, I so believe in journalism, I've been banking lawyers, so believe in banking. Give that person a mortgage. Oh, it doesn't matter if he doesn't have any assets. It doesn't matter,
So, David, as a former journalist, you know that most journalists outside of New York City are always looking for the local angle.
Yep.
And so imagine my surprise when I was reading your book, which Truth in Our Times, and it's available outside for purchase and signing when this is over. Imagine my surprise when I run across your prominent and favorable reference to Stanley Dearman, who was the longtime editor of the Neshoba Democrat. And David says Stanley Dearman was worth thinking about in 2017. Tell us why.
Yeah, so let me just do a little bit of a backdrop to this so you understand what the book is about. Is that, but what I tried to do was capture what I had been through as a lawyer and what the Times had been through as a news organization over roughly a couple-year period. So it sort of unfolds beginning in late 2016 up through the first part of 2018. In the middle of that, Stanley Dearman was the subject of an obituary in the New York Times. And I thought that his life spoke to something that I think was important. And that was this. Journalists get a lot of credit for standing up to the government. They should. That's an important thing to do. But the thing that I really took away from Stanley Dearman's life was he also stood up to his readers. When he continued to press for an investigation into the death of 3 civil rights workers, he was taking on a community that wanted to put that behind them. And that is really hard. When you're taking on your readers, when you're challenging your readers, that's hard, but it's really worth doing. And I applaud the Times whenever it is in the pursuit of truth, and as best we can tell it, that it's going to tell hard truths that even its readers don't want to hear. Readers let you know that, and it's just very important that if you're going to be a credible news organization, that you continue to stand up for the truth no matter who it offends.
So I'd point out also that Stanley was a former editor of the Mississippian here at Ole Miss. David, you wrote the most widely read letter in the world in 2016. The quotes are up here for everybody to read.
We had to
Thank you for cleaning it up.
We had to
I
bleep
appreciate
one
that.
of them.
The essence is that Trump, as a candidate, threatened to sue the New York Times because they were going to run a story that would besmirch his reputation. And David, as the lawyer for the New York Times, wrote back a rather cheeky letter, uncharacteristic of what most lawyers would write. And it got a lot of international attention and more than 1 million readers online. Take us behind those events and tell us how it played out.
So let me level set here so we all go back to October 2016. So much happens in this country every day. I know that seems like it was a decade ago. It was not, okay? But October 2016, there was this huge controversy around candidate Donald Trump about his treatment of women as a result of the Access Hollywood tape that was released. And he then spoke about that at the debate on a Sunday night. We then had a story the following week. It was a story about 2 women who said that they had been groped by Mr. Trump many, many years earlier. I thought it was a really good piece of journalism because it did this. It gave readers a chance to assess the evidence, kind of laid it all out there. We obviously believed them. We went to run it if we didn't. But it also gave people an opportunity to look and say, well, why didn't they come forward sooner? All those kind of things. And that I think is what journalism should do. It should empower readers to think. It also had Mr. Trump's response, which was, if you print that, we're going to sue you. So that was in there too. So that day, we published it on a Wednesday morning in the paper, all day online and on talk radio and on the cable news shows. People are talking about Trump's going to sue the Times. Trump's going to sue the Times. And so we keep waiting. It gets to be about 8 o'clock on that Wednesday night. And the head of our PR department calls me and says, I understand that Trump's going to file a suit tonight. Now, I'm a lawyer, and one thing I know for certain is you have to find a court in order to sue somebody. And at 8 o'clock on a Wednesday night in New York, there's only about one court that's open, and that's the Bronx Criminal Court, okay? And a lot of really strange things happen in Bronx Criminal Court, but not libel suits by presidential candidates. But about midnight, shortly after midnight, a letter came to our editor from Mr. Trump's lawyers saying that we should retract the story and that we'd be sued if we didn't. And it was all over the internet. They put it out there. And so I felt that I needed to respond to it as a lawyer letter, and I responded to it. And I think, yeah, it was a fairly pointed response. And I knew that we were going to put it online, but I had no idea what that meant. I had never been an internet star before. I'd never been on YouTube before. I don't have my own YouTube channel. And so this was my 15 minutes of internet fame. And if you've ever had 15 minutes of internet fame, you know it lasts about 14 minutes and 30 seconds too long. It is not all that pleasant. But, you know, my life had been devoted to openness and transparency. I believe in openness and transparency. That is one of the things I stand for. But I didn't realize how much I believed in it until a friend calls me and says, "Do you know that your employer just put your phone number and email address online?" Because this letter was on my letterhead, and there it was. And I said, "Well, I can't really talk to you because I'm getting about an email a minute right at the moment, and from people who've read the letter," and it kind of picked up from there. But it actually was one of those events that I felt reaffirmed what I thought was important about America. People who disagreed with me were civil, believe it or not. People who agreed with me took time to write, and it was quite extraordinary to see people respond to what I hope was a message about freedom of the press.
I guess the New York Times has been the leader in critical reporting about President Trump. And you could arguably say the most negative coverage any president has ever received. You addressed that somewhat in your book when you said, was the press prone to doing critical stories? Were they giving short shrift to the accomplishments of the Trump administration? What's the answer to those questions?
The answer to that question, I think, is that you want a press that focuses on what goes wrong. That whether that's a Republican, Democrat, that you do not want a press that simply flatters its leaders. And so to the extent that did we pursue stories that showed that there was bungling in the White House or that there was corruption or policies that didn't make a lot of sense, I thought we were doing what we should do. I think, as I mentioned in the book, Charles, that journalists do have a prejudice, but it's not Republican, Democrat. It is that they want to be agents of change. People go to journalism school because they want to be part of of pushing society to take a hard look at itself. And that means that they are going to side with the little guy. That means that they are going to question people in power. And I think that's all a good thing. Now, when you report a story, you take on a different obligation. You take on an obligation to fight your own prejudices. And that, I think, is one of those things that just has to be the hallmark of journalism, has been for a long time in this country, needs to continue to be that as well. That you double check, you report against your facts, you try to prove yourself wrong. That's how you get at the truth. I did want to speak to your point about the letter and about whether we're hard on Trump. And if I could just quote from the book, a lot of people after I wrote this letter sort of thought that I was part of some great anti-Trump campaign. And I wanted to set that straight, that because I didn't really feel it was that way. So I received so many emails and calls and so forth from people saying, "Oh, that's great, you're going after Trump." I actually wrote an article in the paper about this, saying this wasn't really about Trump. And this is how I expressed it in the book, if you could bear with me. In an article in the Times after the letter, I expressed my own uneasiness with people who wanted to embrace the letter as one part of some anti-Trump offensive. That was not how I saw it. My role was to take on anyone who was trying to silence the truth or wrap the government in secrecy. When people attempted to bully us or when officials were trying to conceal what the public deserved to know, it didn't matter to me what their political views were. I fought with New York's arrogant Democratic leaders. I sued the Obama administration more than 30 times for withholding information, and I took on the Republicans whenever they were trying to make America a less transparent nation. My job didn't change with administrations. My job was to do whatever I could do to make sure our reporters had a chance to pursue the truth and tell it the best they could. Still believe that it was not about the man, it was about trying to advocate for a free press.
Well, since you raised that part, I'm just going to say the word leaks.
Leaks, okay.
Because it's, but David's reference to, many people are making a big issue about the Trump administration trying to find the source, not the journalist, but the person within the White House or government who's leaking to the journalists. And I think, didn't they even bring up initially, it was like they were traitors or something like that, treasonous. But the Obama administration was quite aggressive about that. So playing off.
Yeah, so let me sort of sketch this out for you because I think it's important to see this. That in this country, the Espionage Act has not been used to punish the press. That is, in 102 years, the press has not been the subject of any sort of criminal indictment for publishing information. Sources are vulnerable, okay? That the Espionage Act has been used against government employees and government consultants. And for much of our time since after World War II, there's been sort of a mutual restraint. The government didn't pursue leakers. They kind of accepted that when things were leaked, that happened. They weren't going to waste their resources looking for leakers. And on the other side, the press, the Washington Post, the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, big-time media, tried to show responsibility of when they published leaks. They tried to make sure that when they published, it was in the public interest. All of that shifts dramatically under the Obama administration when they start prosecuting leakers. They ended up prosecuting, depending on how you count, somewhere between 9 and 12 leakers to the press. There had been only 4 prosecutions in the prior 30 years. It was a serious ramp up. The Trump administration has continued that. And I get it that leaks make people uncomfortable. Someone in the government is violating his or her oath to make information available. But I do think that system of restraint is important because we benefit from leaks. Leaks have historically helped the American public know what was really going on behind the walls of government. If you come to the Times, there is a room that has the great front pages through time, moon landing, assassination of Lincoln, the whole bunch. And there's one from 1873, which shows the Times breaking one of the biggest political scandals in the history of New York. This was Tammany Hall. It was based on leaked information. 1873, someone was leaking government documents to the New York Times, and that became an important part of the story. It's a complicated issue. We obviously, as a society, need the government to keep some things secret, things that are really important, classified national security secrets. But we also need a press that understands that way too much is classified, that classification is used to hide embarrassing facts and wrongdoing and corruption, and we depend on leakers to peel back that secrecy and show us what's really going on. This week we came to understand just how much the government engages in overclassification. You may have seen this. There was a dog that helped get al-Baghdadi, the ISIS leader. Trump tweeted his picture. Good going dog. His name is a classified secret, okay? When we are classifying as secret, national security secrets, the names of dogs, we need to rethink classification. And if you see the picture and you recognize that dog, tell me, because I want to break that story.
So President Trump famously or infamously has labeled the press as the enemy of the people. At some point, you must have realized that went from being mere rhetoric to a major theme of his administration. How has that changed your life and the life of journalists at the New York Times?
Yeah, it's a really good question, Charles. So I would have wished that this letter, had been a game changer, that I could sit here and tell you that, people decided, you know what, freedom of the press is a good thing, let's all stand up for it. But what we've seen since that letter in October 2016 has not been reassuring. 2 months after this letter was published, Donald Trump used for the first time the term fake news. He then proceeded to use it 364 times over the next 2 years before he started filtering in enemy of the people as well along the way. So it's changed things in a couple ways. The first is, I think that it has pressed all of us in the mainstream media to make sure that we are getting the stories right as we can get them. That there is in effect a national referendum on the role of the press, and I think reporters feel a special obligation to make sure we get it right. We've always felt that, but we just understand the stakes are so high. The second thing, as a lawyer, is more in my role as a lawyer than as an employee of the New York Times, is that we are seeing politically motivated libel suits that aren't really very meritorious, that seem to be driven by the belief that a libel suit should be a vehicle for expressing displeasure with the press. And most of those are coming from people who are on the right wing. I think they think that they're going to find judges and they're going to find juries that are sympathetic to the idea that there's fake news, so that even if their suit isn't very strong, maybe they'll get a sympathetic reaction. That has not proved to be true. But I do think that is one of the pieces of fallout from this fake news campaign, if you will. But the third one, and the one I think is important, most important to me, is that our journalists should not be engaged in debates with the president or any other politician. They should be covering them. And when the press is the issue, it becomes imperative on people like me and our publisher, A.G. Sulzberger, to speak up for press freedom, to make sure that we're engaging people and asking the questions and raising the issues with audiences like this. Because I don't really worry about the First Amendment being reinterpreted by courts or laws being changed. What I do worry about is that people will stop believing in the importance of the press, and that will, in time, inevitably lead to a cutback in how much freedom the press has. If people don't think the press is valuable, they're not going to think that we should have laws that protect it. While I was writing this book, a poll came out from the polling company Ipsos, which found that 26% of the American people thought the president should have the right to close a news organization that misbehaved. So wrap your head around that for a second. 1 in 4 Americans thought that the president should have the power to close a news organization that he thought misbehaved. Now, I am fully support anybody who thinks the press should be criticized. That's really important. But the answer is not that the president should have the power to then dictate whether news organizations exist. That is so far removed from the framers' vision. That is so far removed from what people thought when they wrote the Supreme Court, it's hard to know where to begin. Look, whether you're a Republican or you are a Democrat, I guarantee you one thing. You will wake up one morning in some November and you will look at the news and you will see a result in an election that blows your mind. You cannot believe your fellow citizens have done this, right? You will think the voters have gone crazy. Your response to that is not to say, well, we shouldn't have elections anymore. Let's just close down elections because voters will do crazy things. I go to court. Some of our judges are less than gifted. They make stupid decisions. I do not think that I do not walk out of the court and say, well, let's not have courts anymore. That's it. I mean, but that's what that poll is showing about at least 1 in 4 Americans. If the press is failing you, push, press, support better journalism, okay? Demand things of your local paper, demand things of your national papers, demand things of your broadcasters, but you don't give the press the chance to close them down.
Let's follow that up just a minute, because you stated it very well, both here and in the book. And I have to say that 2 sentences in your book are the most haunting lines I have read in probably a couple of decades, more scary than a Stephen King novel. I want to read them for emphasis. It doesn't really matter how much freedom journalists have if no one believes them. A discredited press plays no role in shaping democracy and holding power accountable. Now, you just talked about that and what the public can do. What do journalists at the New York Times or journalists around the country need to do to help resolve this?
Be good at what they're supposed to do, which is tell the story. There is, and Charles knows this from reading the book, there is a bit of a cultural war going on in journalism. There are many younger journalists who believe that the press should be an advocate for a point of view, that should take on causes that they believe in, should challenge causes that they're against. And I think that is bad for democracy. I think that's bad for journalism, and it's actually really bad as a business model. We succeed when we are believed, and we are believed when we show, as our slogan says, neither fear nor favor. To me, that still is the model that journalism should have. So journalists, in my view, do democracy and do freedom of press the greatest service when they go after tough stories and they continue to pursue them no matter what. I think it's really, though, a citizen's issue for all of us in this room and all of us beyond this room to stand up for the idea of a free press, to in our own ways say, look, I'm not going to support this idea that there's fake news. There are mistakes. We have a correction page. Last time I checked, Twitter didn't. And that we are trying to get it right, and to have the support of people, whether you support the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, us, your local newspaper, is really, really important.
I watched an interview with David about the subjects we're talking about tonight. And as the interview was going on, I said, yes, this is a really great ringing defense of the First Amendment. This is good. And so then they went to the audience for questions, which we're going to do in a minute. And the very first question was a question to David: how can we shut down Fox News?
Right.
And so I'm not sure your message got across.
No, I know that's true. So they used to ask about Breitbart. Breitbart seems to have faded, and everybody's now focused on Fox. But one of the first of these speeches I did was at a small college in New York, upstate New York, and a young man stood up and he said that. He goes, what should we do about Breitbart News? And I said, read it. And he just about fell back in his chair. I don't know what he thought my answer was going to be. I'm often struck by the internet has the power to make us so much smarter, and boy, it works every day to make us dumber. Now, and it, everything is there. You can compare stories. I do this all the time. If I'm reading a story, I will look and see how the Wall Street Journal covered. I'll look and see how the local newspaper covered. I want to see that, and I want to make up my own mind. But one of the things that I have said for a long time is I think people on my side of this debate, on my side of this controversy, have done a huge disservice for looking at freedom of the press as a liberal value. It is not a liberal value, it is an American value. When I grew up in a small town in Illinois, Monticello, Illinois, 4,100 people, and I learned to love a free press, not walking the streets of Manhattan, but walking the streets of Monticello. My parents were both World War II veterans. My father was a veteran and my mother was a veteran. She was an Army nurse. That's where they met. And if you were like me, a kid growing up in the 60s and 70s in Illinois, you knew just one thing about politics. One thing you knew for sure, and that was this: the governor goes to jail.
That's in Illinois.
It was an Illinois tradition when I was a kid. Otto Kerner went to jail. Dan Walker, his successor, went to jail. The third guy got off, hats off to my fellow lawyers. When the Secretary of State of Illinois died, Paul Powell, they found shoeboxes, hundreds of thousands of dollars of cash in shoeboxes in his office. And we were thankful that there was a free press that gave us a decent shot of maybe showing what these people were up to and holding them to account. It is a conservative value. It is a liberal value. We just have to believe that. And so I was hopeful that I could get lawyers from Fox to go out and talk with me about this that we both agree on.
You mentioned Twitter a moment ago. A lot of students get their news from Twitter. You wrote, "Living in the time of Twitter further complicates the lives of our editors." What do you mean by that?
Yeah, Twitter has been, and all the platforms have been a great source of circulation for us. It gets our stories out, pushes them out in ways that we couldn't have imagined when we were a print newspaper. We have readers everywhere in the world. So hats off to Twitter for helping us with that. Hats off to Facebook, Instagram, and all the rest as well. But Twitter is an open microphone, and it's amateur night many nights. And unfortunately, our editors have had to contend with the problem of reporters who tweet in ways that do not please the editors, that they feel the statements may be read as a bias, they feel that they are taking sides, and we would prefer that they not do that. We think it reflects on the paper. And so it took them a long time, but because the editors weren't really sure how to address this. We're a free expression type organization. You don't really want to be telling people not to exercise their free speech right. But we finally did a memo, which was really interesting. I write about in the book, which essentially said, look, you make our lives hard. You make it hard for our reporters if you tweet things that come back and they're held accountable for those by the White House or by any other government official. The other thing I would say about Twitter, though, is that when I was having a very undistinguished career in journalism, editors and reporters used to think of sit around and talk about what the public wanted. We didn't know what the public wanted. We knew what we wanted, and we sort of projected our views onto them. With Twitter, there is no secrets about what the public thinks about what you've just done. And I think when that feedback is taken into account, not followed, not dictating what we do, but when we understand better what readers want and whether our message is getting home, I think that's a good thing.
Great.
Going back to the overclassification, you're handling a lot of FOIA cases or Freedom of Information. Can you just tell them a little bit about that? And you may get a question on that from our student media here.
Yeah. So as I said, one of the things that we have tried to do over the last 10 or 11 years is really use the court system to try to press the government to be more open. Those of you who know about the Freedom of Information Act, it's pretty simple. You request a document, government's supposed to give it to you or give you a reason why it can't give it to you. And if you don't like that, you can go to court. System doesn't work that perfectly. It takes a long time. You get a lot of really silly excuses from the government. And so we started suing a lot. And I think it's had some beneficial effect. I think we've moved the law a little bit at times. We've found judges who are sympathetic. It's certainly put pressure on the government to give us documents. They know that when they say no to us, that we're likely to sue them. We're likely to take them to court, and they're going to have to answer to a federal judge about it. But it's really hard when we're dealing with national security because judges are very reluctant to say, oh, you know what? I know better than the CIA. Oh, I know better than the NSA about what should be secret. So getting judges to sign on to that is very hard. But as we've entered the Trump era, the cases have taken a strange turn. I just argued in the Federal Appeals Court in New York a case over the question I never, ever imagined we would ever have to face, and that is, can the president declassify information by tweet? Okay, the president tweeted one day about a top secret program. And so we took the position that if the president tweets about a top secret program, the funding of the Syrian rebels, that it's no longer a secret and we're entitled to the documents about it. Needless to say, the CIA did not see it that way, and so we are in court, but we'll see if those arguments prevail. But these cases are always really hard when it's national security. In the book, I tell the story about one particular case where we had sued for documents from the National Security Agency about spying on American citizens, when they were using the phone company to monitor who called whom. And one of the things the government does is it sends you the documents usually late in the afternoon for whatever reason. It always happens that way. And so in this one particular case, the government said, look, you sued us, we'll release what we can. And so they start releasing the documents. So one afternoon, they release the documents, and I do what I always do. As soon as those documents come, I just send them to a reporter. Just send them on to a reporter because I want the reporters to have them in case the government's sending them to some other reporter. I don't want my reporter to get scooped while the lawyers are sitting on the documents, so I send them over. So reporter calls me a few hours later and says, did you notice that the government has inadvertently released a classified document? That in this pile of documents is a still classified document. Now, my reaction to that is I don't really want to know that because my life is going to be miserable, okay? Because somebody's going to want to know something about this. And so I said, I have not seen that. And so he says, well, I'm going to report on it. And, my role as a newspaper lawyer is, okay, if that's what you feel you need to do, you should report on it. So he starts calling the NSA for comment on this document. And immediately I can see, this next morning, I can see that the government lawyers are calling me. And so I pick up the phone, and government lawyer says, you may have noticed that we inadvertently released a classified document. I said, well, no, I haven't seen that. Is that so? and he said, well, that is so. And I said, okay. And then and he said, well, you got to give it back. And I said, well, I can't give it back. You gave it to me. You just officially gave it to me. And he says, well, no, you have to give it back. And I said, well, I will give it back when a federal judge tells me I have to give it back. And I'm here. You want to go to court? Let's go to court. And he goes, I'll call you back. So about a couple hours later, he calls again, says, got to get the document back. I said, I told you already, I will go to federal court. If a federal judge tells me, I will give it back. But I am not going to go down to the newsroom and tell our reporters, oh, my bad, you can't report something you know to be true. I have to take that document away and you have to have a lobotomy or something. You can't remember you ever saw this. So he says, well, and now this was really low, I thought. He said, well, when we inadvertently gave a classified document to the ACLU, they gave it back. Now he's calling my patriotism into question. You know, like ACLU, ISIS, New York Times. You know, against. You know, and I said, so I called the ACLU. I said, "Is this true?" And I got the humada answer. You know, like, well, yeah, it was kind of true. The document they received didn't seem that important. They didn't want to get into a big fight about it. They weren't the New York Times. So I said, okay. And the government lawyers call me again a few hours later and say, you got to give the document back. You got to it's a classified document. It violates the law to have a classified document. I said, well, I don't believe that, but I told you, let's go see the judge. And the guy says, well, I don't have authorization yet. But I'll call you back. What's your cell phone number? So, well, here's my cell phone number, but you might want to look on NewYorkTimes.com because the document is now published there. So it seems a little late for us to do this. And needless to say, we never went to court. But it just struck me that first, that I was not going to be involved in hiding the truth. Second, if we can publish documents that are essentially taken illegally by Edward Snowden, Daniel Ellsberg, or Julian Assange, how can it be that when the government voluntarily gives me something, I don't have a right to publish that? We never did resolve that, but it was an interesting couple days.
I want to go to the audience because I know you've got some good questions. Greg and I have other questions, but raise your hand so we can bring a microphone to you if you have a question. Who'll go first? Yes, right here.
I was not clear about the position of the newspaper and Twitter. Did you say, would you repeat that? The reporters can use Twitter, they cannot use Twitter?
Yeah, I don't think they're very clear either on what it is. But they are encouraged to use Twitter. They are discouraged from expressing political views. You know, we are eager to have them push out our stories because Twitter is very powerful for that, or to comment or to push out other people's stories. Where we come into conflict is when anybody is making a political statement that may be attributed to the Times and suggest bias, whether that's marching in a protest or speaking out at a political rally or going on Twitter.
It would be the same with their appearance on a television show?
Yeah. But you know, we live in a world where there is a lot of opinions out there, and I think sometimes reporters get caught up, especially on Twitter, and in that debate with others.
Other questions? Yes, ma'am, right here.
Concerning the whistleblower, are there reporters from the Times looking to determine who the whistleblower is?
The answer to that, I believe, is the reporters from the Times know who the whistleblower is. I mean, they know his identity. Let me reprise what happened there, right? So the whistleblower goes to Congress and says that something's gone awry on Ukraine policy. The Times decides to identify him as what's known as a CIA detailee, which means a CIA employee who is assigned to a different agency, in this case, the White House. His lawyer called me that morning before we published. I've known his lawyer for 25 years, and said, you shouldn't do this. This will endanger him, and so forth. Our editors felt, this isn't a legal decision, but also I'm going to recap what our journalists decided. Our editor decided that it was important for people to know that he was a CIA agent, that he wasn't, as the White House was saying, some rogue Democrat or somebody who was out to get the White House. This was somebody who was giving his own conscientious account of what happened. And so we felt that was important to do. Widely criticized. People thought that we made him subject to harassment or danger. Our editor actually believes that the White House already knew who he was. In all of these cases, when it comes to actually identifying them by name, a whole lot of factors go into the decision. And again, it's not a legal decision. I'm just telling you what our editors would think. Is there public interest in his identity? Does it compromise his safety? Does it add credibility to our story? Is there a public value in knowing it? Will the name be meaningful to the public? And in this particular case, they sort of split the baby and described who he was, but didn't use his name. And I understand a lot of people were unhappy with that. That's why Twitter helps us understand how unhappy people are. But as I've often said, journalism is an art, not a science. Whether we get it right or not is open to debate on any given judgment. We did the best we could. I certainly, in my conversation with the lawyer, supported what we did. But I know a lot of people thought otherwise.
Other questions? Yes, sir, right up here.
I'm half embarrassed to ask this, but it's about Facebook. I just saw a report and just read about a report where about the politicians Facebook will allow politicians to knowingly lie, but yet individuals, they'll take down a post, but they'll permit a politician, even though they know it's a bald-faced lie.
Yeah, so they actually allow a lot of individual lying on Facebook, just not about consequential things. I think some people didn't have as good a time as they said, last night, as they say on Facebook. But let me speak here as a First Amendment lawyer, not as representative of Times, because Times will be taking positions on what Facebook should and shouldn't do. As a First Amendment type lawyer, my initial instinct always is more speech, not control on speech. That I would always prefer that the remedy be that people speak up when they see fake speech, when they see falsity, and address that and let people decide. It gets hard when you're talking about organizations and platforms as big as Facebook. And so Facebook's policy is that if there is an organized campaign, this just came out with this, if there is an organized campaign by the Russians or the Iranians or the Chinese to mislead the American public and they find out about it, they're going to take it down. They're going to remove that. When it is an American politician who is making a statement which may not be true, they are defending the right of that to stay up. My preferred remedy, again, I'm not speaking for the Times, just me speaking as a First Amendment lawyer, my preferred remedy would be that they label that as dubious, that they make some indication that people have complained about the truthfulness of this ad and then link to someplace where you can find out more about it. That to me is more consistent with how the First Amendment should work. But very hard decisions. And if you think about it, there are three ways to police falsity online. One is to ask the government to do it, and I'm against that. I think if you let the government do that, we're going to end up in a very bad place. I don't really want the government being a ministry of truth. There's a reason Orwell used that term. The second thing is to let Mark Zuckerberg decide. I'm not really keen on that. This is a corporate behemoth with its own corporate interests. I'm not really keen on sort of ceding that kind of power. Well, if you take those two off the table, it's up to us, you and me, okay? That it's up to readers to be skeptical, to ask questions, to research. It's very hard to be a citizen today. There is so much information. There's so much to wade through. But I think the founders got it right. That's where it resides, that over time, we have to be better users of information, whether that's in the newspaper, online, or in our conversations with fellow citizens.
David, isn't a proper parallel as it relates to your answer that it's just as reasonable to let Mr. Zuckerberg decide what the truth is as it is to let Mr. Sulzberger decide what the truth is in New York?
I think that's right. I mean, clearly Facebook has its own First Amendment issues. It's a private company. It's allowed to do that. I mean, I was very disappointed with the way they handled the 2016 election. And in the book, I say, Facebook initially says, well, not for us to police this. If people get misled, they get misled. It's up to them to figure it out. And we don't have a responsibility. And it always reminded me of a guy who was driving his car, slams on the brake, and causes a 136 car pileup, and looks in his rearview mirror and goes, man, those are terrible drivers. I wonder what happened. Only later did Facebook acknowledge that the Russians had reached more than 130 million users on Facebook. And it was only after that they started labeling dubious reports and trying to do something about it. I support that. If you're talking about an organized foreign campaign, I think you should do something about that. But I do have to emphasize that the research on fake news is inconclusive. It's very complicated. When you think about why you vote for somebody, or why you like something or don't like something, or why you support a cause or don't, it's not like you read an article and then cause and effect, you go and do something. You take into account a lot of different inputs, and you make a lot of different judgments about things before you come to a conclusion. And one of the early studies about fake news found that heavy users of fake news sites are also heavy users of legitimate news sites. And it's hard to know what to make of that. It's hard to know, why is it that people who go to these fake news sites and find out that Hillary Clinton is controlled by extraterrestrial beings, then looks at the New York Times. Well, are they going, yeah, just as I thought, New York Times is in Hillary's pocket. They don't report that extraterrestrial beings are controlling her. Or do they go, I need to check that out. Oh, it's not there, it must not be true. Who knows? But it's a complicated process that the decision making, and a complicated problem.
Another question back here. Yes, sir.
Okay, so how do you feel about big tech, mainly Facebook and YouTube, targeting and silencing mainly conservative voices? How do we counteract this when the synthetic algorithms are already geared to go a certain way?
I don't know what their algorithms do because they don't tell us. So I'm going to plead agnosticism on the premise of your question. I do not know whether, in fact, that's true. I do know this, that conservative voices should be heard on the internet. And if there is an organized campaign by anyone to silence conservative voices, we are all lessened by that. We all benefit by having a debate, and it gets complicated when we start talking about civility online, but I think we can do it. I think we can actually learn how to disagree with each other again. Somebody pointed out in my book, I always say about various things, everything's going to be okay, and it's never okay. So I do suffer from false optimism, but I do think that the greatest thing we could give ourselves as a country is to return to our ability to disagree. And that means hearing people out and having a rational discussion.
That's such a positive note to end on. I want to ask you one last question.
Okay.
You said the First Amendment is not really dead, but it will live long only if the American people fall in love with it again. What do you think the chances are of that?
I'm an optimist, Charles. I think that there is a great chance that, it's a funny thing because the president famously said on February 24th, 2017, that no one loved the First Amendment more than him and nobody needed it more than him because of all the things he said. Later that day, his press secretary barred the New York Times and other disfavored media from a press conference. So I do think that we can find a way to embrace, wherever we are on the political spectrum, the idea that people should be heard, that we should have a debate about important issues, and we should try to do that in a respectful way to the degree we can. When people say, well, how's that going to happen? I don't have a clear answer. It's going to take a long time, though. I think it starts with young people. I think it starts with schools. It starts with people in grade school and elementary school learning to be better readers. But here's what makes me hopeful, is that if you believe, as I do, that having a vibrant debate about issues, not being dismissive of other people's arguments, listening and trying to react to that, we don't start at zero. It's not like nobody believes that. There is a significant number of people who believe that. And we don't have to get to 100%. We don't have to have the entire country agree to that. What we need is a critical mass of people who believe that, are willing to stand up for it, and invite others to join them in that. And that's what makes me optimistic. I do think we can get there.
That's great. I saw an anxious hand here. Let's bring a mic here and we'll let this be the last question. You hadn't brought a mic to anybody. Give you a chance. Last question.
You had mentioned something earlier in what you just said about two ends of a political spectrum.
Yeah.
Do you feel like that's actually something that's really dividing the country? We have so many different types of people that come here. We have 17 different boxes of cereal, but you're telling me there's two different ways to live life?
Yeah, you're right. When I say two, I should probably say many.
Okay.
yeah. I was speaking that it tends to get divided, and I think that's part of the problem. It tends to get divided up by people like me into there's a right wing and there's a left wing. There's actually a multitude of people on the left. There's a multiple people on the right. There's me standing in the middle.
Will we get to a point where an election will have more than two parties to vote for?
I used to believe in that a lot. In 1980, I was out on the streets of Philadelphia supporting an independent candidate by the name of John Anderson. I thought that more was better. I'm not so sure. I actually, over time, I never thought I would have said this back when we were in college, that we need more smoke-filled rooms. We need parties that impose discipline and come up with really good candidates. I'm still thinking about that one, but I'm certainly not sure that seeing 11 people trying to debate on stage is the best way to figure out which one's best.
The book is Truth in Our Times. I highly recommend it to you. It's a very interesting read written by David McCraw. Join me in thanking him.
Thank you.